This is a production of Cornell University.
Hello, everyone. So this is a photo of Aurora Musgrave Field where the trials are happening. So for today's talk, I'm going to first talk about the social ecological perspective, how I'm thinking about this research, how I'm situating myself in it. Then I'm going to talk about three different research projects that I have going on. The first is plant competition within mixtures. The second is mixtures within cropping systems. And the third is cropping systems within New York dairy farms. So the social ecological systems perspective with a hyphen emerged from systems level ecology. People were studying landscape level things, the Everglades, whole watersheds, and they realized that human actions shape the capacities of ecosystems, and humans are in fact part of ecosystems. And this is the thinking that I'm going about with all this research, that we are a part of the ecosystems. They're not just linked together. So SES has a specific definition for resilience, has three different components. The first is the amount of disturbance a system can absorb and still remain within the same state. So this is how much you can absorb. The second is the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization. So you might imagine if a farmer were to desire to change a practice, maybe they wouldn't be able to because they're locked in by certain regulations or the market, or they need to continue something, so they can't recreate themselves. And the third thing is the degree to which the system can build and increase its capacity for learning and adaptation. So learning is constantly an important thing, improving on oneself. So the definition or a sentence that I really like from some work by Keith Tidball over in Department of Natural Resources is resilience is this interaction between ecology, economics, social structures that restore ecosystem services. And when we talk about resilience, this is really abstract term. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. And so for this, I think of resilience of a farm in the face of extreme weather events. And the reason I'm thinking about this is the Northeast has seen a 71% increase in extreme precipitation events since 1958. This is a graph from the 4th National Climate Assessment that came out last Friday. And each bar is a year. The orange line is a 9-year average. And so this is, again, extreme precipitation events. We can see that they're increasing. So although temperatures might increase the growing season in the Northeast, which could lead to a longer growing season, we are going to have some really wet weather, really frequent, intense rainstorms, and also short and medium term droughts. So I think of crop diversification as a strategy to enhance resilience. And I just go back to this saying, putting all your eggs in one basket, because essentially this is what we're doing with a lot of cropping systems, in that they're very simplified and we're maxing out the productivity of them. But crop diversity adds this variability and redundancy. So this variability diversity begets diversity. If you have more diverse plants, likely that you're going to have more diverse microbes, or you'll have more diverse insects. And so this is pretty exciting, but it does come at a cost. It isn't as simple as all your eggs in one basket. And I want to make that clear, because I would say that's probably the biggest difficulty with crop diversification as a strategy. So if I understand this as a strategy, then there's some things that we need to figure out. And so the first question that I asked myself is, how can intercrop mixtures be optimized for biomass production? So how can we improve these crop diversification practices even more? And so I'm looking specifically at intercrop mixtures, so multiple species at the same time. The second question I asked myself, what are the effects of diversity over time? And so if they take some time to take into effect, are we doing the right kind of experiments that would allow us to see some of the benefits of crop diversification? And finally, who's going to use this strategy and why? So how does it fit in? What is the context? So the first question, how can intercrop mixtures be optimized for biomass production? I'm going to use cover crops as an example for this. So this experiment that we did was on summer annual forages, but if you were to think of them as cover crops, which they could be, less than 5% of row cropland in the United States is cover crops. So cover crops are getting a lot of hype, but we still have a really limited adoption. And a lot of people have done studies as to why that might be. One of the barriers identified was this associated cost. So buying extra seed, having to take this extra time. So the purpose of this experiment is to examine inter and intra-specific competition to understand complementarity, with the hypothesis that mixtures with greater complementarity will have greater cover crop biomass. And so for this experiment, we had 2 grasses and 2 legumes, pearl millet, abbreviated with an M, sorghum sudangrass with an S. Legumes were cowpea, abbreviated with a C, and sun hemp, abbreviated with an H. And I just want to refer back to some previous work I've done. This came out of my master's, where we published this paper on functional diversity in summer annual legume intercrops. So we used the exact same species, and we just seeded 3 species mixtures using a replacement rate design. So you have a monoculture rate, and then 1/3 of that for a 3 species mixture. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and then the way you assess, the most common way to assess intercrops, I would say, is the land equivalent ratio, which is essentially of that species, the proportion of the biomass in the intercrop divided by the biomass of that species in the monoculture. And so if we're seeding these species each at 1/3 of their monoculture rates, our break-even point for land equivalent ratio would be 1. You plant 1/3 of the seeds, expect 1/3 of the biomass. And so we see from the results, and the abbreviations are down here, the 4 3 species mixtures all had land equivalent ratios greater than 1, which is awesome, right? It's like, great, this intercropping worked. But what does that mean? What is really happening within that number? So what we did with this paper is we took the single term, the partial LAR, so just one term of this model. We made it each a point on a spider plot. So these spider plots have 3 species, thus 3 points. And if you were to fill in this inner triangle here, that would be 1/3. That would be your break-even point. And so we see that some mixtures have LERs above 1, and there's mutual overyielding. Each species does better in the intercrop than it would if it had been planted separately. But some of the mixtures, you see one species is really pulling that biomass up, and it comes at the consequence suppressing these slower growing species. So the one thing we learned is if you're intercropping with annuals in a mixture, they gotta have similar growth rates. They gotta leave the gate at the same time, or else that kind of competition is gonna continue, and you won't see the benefits of these species because they won't appear. as much. So practical questions for this experiment is the question is, what is the optimal seeding rate for each species to maximize the biomass? And then another question is, how many species should go into the mixture? I'm going to answer the second question for you now. It's 2, because this is the biculture data that I'm presenting. But it still remains a question. And so we looked at what the optimal seeding rates were using this response surface design. Essentially, it's a grid. On the x-axis, you see the percentage of standard seeding rates for one species, say sorghum. And then on the y-axis, you see a different species. So this kind of design allows us to parse out inter and intra-specific competition. So it comes across, it's more powerful. So for this, we have 8 different seeding rates of a monoculture. So we go from 40% of the standard seeding rate all the way up to 120% of the standard seeding rate. We do this for the other species too. We do it for all the monocultures. And then for the bicultures, what we do is we also plant at 8 different species. So here we have 20% sorghum, 20% the standard seeding rate of millet, 40% sorghum, 20% millet. How does changing these ratios change the outcome? And so there are 6 different biculture combinations with 4 species. So we have the original 8 different seeding rates for the monoculture, 32, 8 times 6, 48. So we have a lot of different plots. What we did, how we planted this happened summer of 2014 in Musgrave. What we did is we borrowed a cone seeder drill from the plant breeding. We got David Benchner to drive it around, and we seeded these small plots, about 8 square meters, and we had applied to the field about half the recommended rate of nitrogen for sorghum, sudangrass. So we're splitting the fertility evenly between the legumes and the grasses. If we over-fertilize, more grasses would show up. If we under-fertilize, I don't know, everything would look bad. So we, after about 50 days, we harvested. We took 2 meter quadrats, clipped all that biomass off, separated crop and weed species, and we also collected density. And so biomass and density are the important things to remember going into this next slide. So this is the biomass density relationship. So as you increase density of a species, as you add more plants to a place, you're going to increase the yield up until a point where you're not going to increase the yield and your per plant weight is going to get smaller. And so what we did is we took yield. We have the biomass data. So we plugged it in there, say the biomass of millet. We also have the density of millet, which is NM. And so we plugged in the density for NM, and then we were able to solve for A naught, which is the weight of a millet plant without other millet plants around it, and also for I, which is this measure of intra-specific competition. And so Spitters in 1983 said, if you add other species, this assumption, this relationship still holds. And so with additional species, we just added this extra term into the equation. So IS is the measure of interspecific competition, and well, that should say NS is the density for the sorghum. So let's go through this. I don't know. I find this stuff really heady. So it's helpful for me to go through it multiple times. So here we have this biomass density relationship, and I've just given you some numbers to deal with. So I am the intra-specific competition coefficient is 0.1. And then if we were to say increase 0.1 to 0.5, we see the shape of this curve changes quite dramatically. It's reaching that asymptote much faster. It's a sharper curve. Now, if we were to add a second species, right, this is only the monocultures. If we were to add a second species, we see that the curve changes even more with this addition. So the IM is back to the first panel, set at that one. But then we have this extra term, IS and then NS. And so the shape it has changed, and that's due to the interspecific competition. So real life data. We did this for all the bicultures. I'm only going to show you a couple of them. So this is the millet, sorghum, sudangrass. What we have on the x-axis is millet density. Then we have millet biomass on the y-axis. The blue circles are the monocultures of the millet. The green squares are the millet biomass when it's in a millet sorghum biculture. And so this curve is fit with the equation that I showed you before. And then this dotted curve, that's we use the average density of the sorghum when it's in the biculture with millet. We use that for the NS term. And we are able to see that the shape of the curve changes quite a lot, indicating that there's high interspecific competition. When you add sorghum to millet, you're going to reduce that millet biomass. And how much, you might wonder? Well, then in this next graph, I have sorghum density on the x-axis, still millet biomass on the y-axis. So when millet's in monoculture, those are the blue dots, you see the yield declines quite a lot as you increase the density of the sorghum sudangrass. But this is just one side of the story. There are always two sides to a story. So what happens with the sorghum when millet is added to it, if we're to think about that? It's not really affected at all. So when these two curves match up, there's less interspecific competition happening. And we see that also with this fourth graph here with millet density. You can add millet density. It's not really affecting the sorghum sudangrass biomass. So this is the same graph set up as before, but now it's millet and sun hemp together. We can see the differences between these two curves. They're slight, millet's slightly affected, somewhat affected by the sun hemp, and sun hemp is also slightly affected by the millet. So after putting the biomass, the density, and solving for the competition coefficients, what we got were all these competition coefficients, and what do these numbers mean? How do you relate them to one another? So one way this is done is with the relative competitive ability. So you're taking the intra-specific competition coefficient and dividing it by the interspecific competition coefficient. So how this reads is you have millet with sorghum, millet with sun hemp, millet with cowpea. So this basically says it takes 0.37 sorghum plants to make up a millet plant. So when the RC is less than 1, you have greater interspecific competition, right? Your denominator is larger. There's like lots of numbers I'm throwing at you, and we're trying to find patterns within them. What's happening across these 6 different bicultures? So what I did was just separate it out, and I went through and I said, which one's bigger? Inter, intra, inter, intra. And some patterns did emerge. We see with sorghum, sudangrass, intra-specific competition was always greater than inter-specific competition. And then with cowpea, it's like a whole different story. Inter-specific competition was greater. And if you go out to a field and you look at the field, you can kind of guess. You're like, wow, this cowpea plant in upstate New York, it probably isn't growing as well as the sorghum sudangrass. So the other two species, millet and sun hemp, they're a bit of a mixed bag, right? And there are two sides to every story. So how do you weigh both sides of the story? How do you figure out, what the true story is, what the ultimate story is? So you can just multiply the relative competition coefficients together, and you get the niche differentiation index. So if this niche differentiation index is above 1, then resource partitioning is occurring because the intra-species overall for both of the species, both sides of the story, intra-specific competition is greater than inter-specific competition. So this means it's better to, have different plant with different species, maximize that resource partitioning, get out more resources. So what I did is I multiplied the RCs out, I got the NDIs, I put them in chronological order, and this other pattern emerged. And I say it so excitingly because I was so pumped to finally see something come out of this. Is that the millet plants were in the top 3. So they have the highest NDI. So that tells me something about millet plants, and they're good partners, sort of thing. Good partner plants. So results today: relative competitive ability going from high to low. Sorghum sudangrass, sun hemp, millet, followed by cowpea. Then the mixtures with the greatest complementarity contained millet. That's great. And then the third thing overall, just in general, is that we'll be able to use these kinds of findings to recommend seeding rates that can maximize productivity of the mixture. And perhaps, and I haven't done it yet, because the economics might tell a whole different side of the story, but perhaps this could reduce the cost barrier, right? If we improve the precision of these mixtures. So the second question I'm going to ask is, what are the effects of crop diversity over time? What we did for this experiment, first in background, this experiment was funded by an organic research extension initiative, thank you, grant. And so we're looking at organic managed systems. And the reason this is important is because 44% of certified organic producers are in the Northeast, and New York has the most of all. We're the largest producer of milk, organic milk, in the Northeast. And the other competitors are Texas and California, right? They're operating at a whole different magnitude of scale. But since 2014, the number of certified organic farms in New York has doubled. So this is happening right now. So in the Northeast, in the face of extreme weather events, farmers are having some trouble meeting the pasture rule, which requires that organic herds be out on pasture for 90 days. 90 days of the growing season. And so we think that farmers could supplement their production with planting, perhaps by planting some annuals, be able to extend that growing season. And so this is where we're operationalizing resilience. Resilience is an abstract term. It's great, but how does it actually work in real life? So here, we want cropping systems that absorb risk. So we're going to look at different levels of crop diversity. And then we also want to be able to adapt to change. So we're going to look at 2 different cropping systems, perennial and annual. And this would allow the farmer to pivot. If something should happen in their perennial fields, say the summer slump, what could they do to feed their cows now? And then the third one, which I'm not talking about at all, is restoring production. So what external factors are out there? Does the farmer have access to capital? Can they get a loan from a bank that would help them do these practices? Are they getting disaster payments? So what we did is we looked at 4 different levels of diversity. So first, the low diversity level, 1 species, 1 variety. Then we looked at the con-specific diversity. So we still had 1 species, but instead we had 4 different varieties. What we tried to do is max out the variety of those varieties. So say for alfalfa, we chose different characteristics. One of them was crown rooting, one of them was branch rooted, one of them had potato leafhopper resistance. All of them claimed to have like the best forage quality. But those are the characteristics, and we tried to look for different seed sellers to also max on that diversity in case they're developing lines from the same stock. And so then for the high level of diversity, so that so that was conspecific, 1 species, 4 varieties. Then for the heterospecific, we had 4 different species, each at 1 variety. And then for the high level, we had 4 species, 4 different varieties. And we really tried, although we tried to max variety out, we did try for similar winter dormancy. We want our experiments to survive. And we did try and line up maturity, because that's a big thing if you have multiple species, whether you're going to get optimal forage quality from that. So then we have 2 different cropping systems, an alfalfa-based perennial system, and then alfalfa, orchard grass, timothy, and white clover, and then a double-cropped annual system. So winter annuals had triticale, cereal rye, winter pea, red clover, and the summer annuals had sudangrass, pearl millet, sorghum sudangrass, and ryegrass together. And this experiment took place in our beloved Musgrave Farms in Aurora, but it also happened on other research farms. We were working with Heather Darby up in Vermont, and Rich Smith in New Hampshire in Madbury. And you can imagine, all these sites are quite different, right? It would like, you'll have cooler climates, different weather, different soil. And so there are a lot of differences when you think about, oh, planting date, harvesting date, how much fertilizer to apply. So what we decided to do was to manage each site independently, but really get on the same track, following the same protocols, going through the same process in the decision making, to how like what our cues were for management. So we established this experiment in the summer of 2016, randomized complete block design with 4 to 5 replications per site. And going into the management in a little more detail, we manage each cropping system we manage the 2 cropping systems differently. And we manage each cropping system at the set by the needs of the low diversity treatment. So this is a more conservative approach, because if you're adding diversity, you're really making it more difficult to see positive results when you add diversity. So if we see good things happening or shouldn't be normative. Yes. So we also followed fertilizer recommendations made by seasonal soil tests. So each site had a different phosphorus extraction, right? And so we all sent things to Agro One. They did, we told them what crops we were growing, and then we followed what they recommended for fertilizer. When we were harvesting, we set similar thresholds for the harvest. So alfalfa was harvest stage 2 when there were 1 to 2 buds per node. Triticale was at swollen root stage. Sudangrass when it was about 3 feet high. Great. So this figure was developed by Chris Pelzer, and I really like it because it kind of maps out what the potential is. So can you guys? I think the writing's small. So we have months at the bottom, and these blue bars indicate winter annuals. Yellow is summer annuals, and these black squares are when we think we could take a harvest. So these are potential harvest scenarios. So the annuals, maybe we only get one cut for the summer annuals, but perhaps we could get two cuts. And then for the perennials, there are a whole myriad of options we could do. We were aiming to take 3 cuts. In the first year, we only got 2 cuts. And this past year, growing season 2018, we got 4 cuts. So that was pretty, this sort of shows the flexibility that the different sites have as to like what they're going to do and why they might do it. So some hypotheses for these. The annual system will be more productive than the perennial system, and that productivity and stability, yield stability, will be greater in more diverse treatments. Here we have this cool photo of just a triticale monoculture and then the mixture of those 4 species, and you can visually see the difference there. So I'm just briefly going to tell you about results, not from this most recent growing season, because I do not yet have that data, but from the growing season before, so 2017. 2017, we have cumulative growing degree days. New York's a little bit warmer than everyone. The other 2 sites, and then we have cumulative precipitation. As you might remember, 2000, and I will never forget, 2017 was a very wet year. So it was hard for alfalfa to establish. Vermont had a little bit of a drier season. So data collecting for this experiment and some analyses that we're doing, crop biomass, weed biomass, we'll look at weed communities, forage quality, we'll look at the economics in a partial budget analysis. Other work that's happening is we're looking at soil health, differences in soil microbial, and then also, so that's with Uri, who's a grad student with Matt. And then also, I had a student do her honors thesis just this past year with disease incidence and severity in these plots. So we're really trying to fill out this information here. So briefly, some results. I did a linear mix model where I summed the crop biomass up over the year. So total crop biomass and all for each treatment in each system. They use location, system, diversity, and their interactions as fixed effects. And we did see a significant interaction between location and system, and also significance in the different diversity, as we see here in this graph. So this is the total crop biomass, and we see that the heteroanhyde, these higher, more diverse mixtures, produce more biomass. And I think this was largely because alfalfa didn't really like all this wet weather. And so when you added grasses to it, the grasses, the orchard grass and the timothy, were much more tolerant, could produce a lot more biomass. So I think that's what's driving the differences here. But in this past year, it looked a lot different. The alfalfa made a comeback. So 2017, the results between location and cropping system, New Hampshire and New York, the annual cropping system produced more biomass than the perennials. In Vermont, we didn't see a difference. Perhaps that was because Vermont was a little drier. Also, there is likely a knowledge factor. I think Heather has had a lot of experience growing alfalfa, whereas I had not. Measure of stability. So one measure of stability is the coefficient of variation. And so this is a measure of dispersal, you know, where the yields similar, were they quite different. And you take the standard deviation and divide it by the means for those treatments. And these are just the averages across all the different sites, and they're not statistically different. I want to say that. But in general, the lower the CV, the more stable the crop yield. And so we see that perennials had numerically lower CV than the annuals. And we also see that the high diversity treatments had a lower CV. But we also know that, the lower CV. Yes, that's all I want to say on that. So results to date, the annuals did look to be more productive than the perennials. More diverse treatments were more productive. For the 2018 growing season, the alfalfa made this huge bounce back. I was really excited about it. Wasn't sure if either of us were going to make it. We were able to get 2 cuts of those summer annuals, and we got 4 cuts for the perennials. We're gonna take one last harvest, the winter annuals, and one more cut of the perennials, and then that'll be it for this experiment in my field work. So I know I don't have a ton of time left, but I want to talk about this third question. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. And the context of who are going to use crop diversification strategy and why they're going to use them, that's really important, I think, to consider and to keep in mind as I do this other research. So briefly, the state of dairy farms. I collected these headlines, and of course, I tell people, oh, I'm going to do interviews with dairy farmers, and everybody like sits me down and looks me straight in the eye, and they say, it's a really terrible time for dairy farmers right now, and I get that, and it looks really hard to be a dairy farmer. So you have all kinds of headlines. Farmers are managing for their margins. So anytime they can make a couple cents extra, that's what they're doing. We've seen a spate of bankruptcies, New York being one of the larger ones. And so this is from, I just grabbed these from Winston et al. These are dairy farmers, and I know they're blurry, sorry. These are dairy farmers in the Northeast. So before in the 1960s, we had about 110,000, and now in 2000, it's about 20,000 dairy farmers. So this is the milk, the herd size. So the number of milking cows per 1,000 heads. So we've gone from 3,000, it's declined. We have less cows than before, but they are making more milk. And this is, to me, an astonishing idea that since the 1960s, we've gone from, on average, say 8,000 pounds per year, all the way up to about 18,000 pounds per year. So it's incredible advancement. So when I think more specifically, what am I trying to do with this body of work? I'm interested in what farmer characteristics influence the adoption of crop diversification practices. I'm interested in how a farmer's social network, how that influences adoption, and more generally, how farmers conceptualize resilience, because my idea of what resilience is probably quite different from somebody else's definition of resilience. what I'm going to do with this, here's my plan. And this hasn't really been done yet, so it's still very much, but it's a pretty solid plan. I'm going to say that much. I haven't done it yet, but I think it's a pretty solid plan. I'm looking at this Western production region, which is the big milk production region in the state of New York. It goes here, so it's surrounding counties, counties that are also facing similar weather events as I am with my field season. I'm gonna try and talk to 50 farmers, organic and conventionally managed farmers across a range of herd sizes. And these interviews will take, I would say, about an hour each. So I spent a long time developing this interview guide, and Rich knows from the beginning of draft 1, and now I think it's like draft 20 something.
You're halfway there.
So we have 3 components. Basically general farm questions. How many acres do you have? Are you supported by an off-farm income? How much land do you rent versus own? Where do you sell your milk to? And then also have cropping systems questions. This is where the bulk of it is, because this is where my research interests lie. So what is your typical crop rotation? In the past 5 years, have you had significant yield loss on your fields? Really trying to understand what the farmer is going through and how they consider their cropping systems. So ultimately, I ask about the awareness, perception, the extent of adoption, if they've started to adopt or considering adopting a practice, motivations, and barriers for all these different crop diversification practices, and a couple of extra ones thrown in because I think might be helpful to enhance the resilience. So if they've reduced tillage, they have tile drainage. Yeah. And then finally, I'm asking farmers about their networks. So this is more like a survey portion of the interview. Before the interview is like a conversation and I'm talking to them. And then this reads like a survey, and farmers can check what events have they attended? What organizations do they belong to? What resources do they access when they're looking for different kinds of crop diversification information? Who do they turn to for advice? So far, I've done a few interviews. So far, every farmer has told me they talk to their local extension agent when seeking advice, which I think is a really important idea to not forget. So I have some hypotheses on this. In general, I'm talking to organic and conventional dairies. I think there's a lot that can be said, values, judgments, the different actors in these two spaces. And I think crop diversification, I'll see more crop diversification practices in the organic managed system, in part because there's a regulation that requires that the farmers go to pasture with their herd, and maybe less so in conventional. What this means, is that there's probably different adoption pathways for adoption of these practices. You would use different language. You would interact with different groups if you wanted to get these ideas diffused. So another idea that I have is to measure aspects of resilience. And these are the 3 components I introduced earlier: the absorptive, adaptive, restorative. And I've just listed some of the things that I'm asking out now. So this is sort of a conceptual idea in the works. So if you have higher soil organic matter, then you might be able to absorb more risk, etc. And if you have seen greater yield stability, less yield loss, perhaps that's a greater example of having resilience or a more resilient cropping system. So progress so far on this project, I did 5 pilot interviews during the summer. 3 were with conventional farmers, 2 were with organic farmers, and every time I talk to somebody new, I think, oh, here's a better way to organize this. Like here's how the flow could improve. I've added new questions as they've come up, changed wording for things. So it's a really iterative process, and just yeah, it's a great learning process. And I'm going to continue to do the interviews this winter and next spring. So to circle back around to what I talked about in the beginning, to understand crop diversification as a strategy to enhance resilience, I asked, how can intercrop mixtures be optimized for biomass production? So you can design mixtures that maximize complementarity using these competition models. I see people talk about digital ag or precision ag, and I get very excited because that's where I see this fitting in. It's a really data-intensive effort. Then what are the effects of crop diversity over time? We need to study this and design experiments that allow us to understand some of these benefits that we're not going to see for a while, or may not see for a while, right? You can't plan an extreme weather event, or I guess, yeah, you can't. I'm going to say that, you can't. And then finally, who's going to use this strategy and why? And so different farms likely have different adoption pathways who people are engaging with. So to finish this up, I'd like to thank this whole list of people that were like, I honestly couldn't have done it without you, and I appreciate all the conversations that we've had this time. And a big thank you to my lab family. You guys are awesome. Yes, so thank you.
I think we have time for at least one question.
I'll ask a question. On that first experiment with the competition,
yeah,
what kind of millet was it, and it was the millet you used, that is what species? Was it adapted to our region?
It was a Wonderleaf Pearl millet, and we got it from King's Agri-Seed. And so they've been selling this kind of millet to farmers in Pennsylvania and New York. So I imagine it was adapted. Yeah. Question, Johannes.
Thank you. Great on the work. I really liked how the rigorous mechanistic question that you tried to ask in your first section. I was wondering whether you could shoot from the hip and say, what were the reasons that made millet such a good mixture body? Did you consider measuring root activity distribution or light interception or any other traits that would identify what it made such a good?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and I love the term millet as a planting buddy. I spent days of my life out in the field with a point sensor and a light bar, and it's really tough to take that kind of light interception. But to shoot from the hip, I think millet is a good planting buddy because it's very plastic in terms that it's pretty adaptable. It sees I'm going to anthropomorphize this plant a little bit. It sees the plant and it says, I know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and I can sort of adapt to this. So that's how I think about it, but I haven't taken any mechanistic stuff, and the data with the light interception didn't work out. I haven't looked at the roots. Maybe you want to. Yeah? Maybe this guy does.
Thank you.
Yeah, Harold.
Yeah, so, and I was wondering about, what can you really recommend to a farmer at this point in time? And one of the questions that always kind of comes up is you have this location interaction, and probably location is weather as well,
Sure.
weather, soil, and all that. And I think that's always the challenge that we have in making recommendations. There's other factors that come into it. For example, maybe your fields did not receive manure, and on these farms they would have received manure. Would the competitive ability of, say, a millet be changed if there was manure in the environment and all that? So are you at this point in time comfortable standing up in front of a crowd of farmers and say, these are some of the conclusions that I can draw from my research, and I can be pretty assured that this will work out for you?
Yes, that's a great question. So if I were to stand up in front of a group of farmers, I would say millet's 3 times cheaper than any of the other seed that I use. I think the economics of this situation, even though like agronomically, that's not what we just talked about, but I think economically, that's a pretty pressing concern. And then planting alfalfa with grasses seemed to be a great way to ensure more biomass. And I think farmers in New York tend to do that. Yeah. But I think crop diversification I think we'd be in a very scary place if there were prescriptions of I don't think these solutions are prescriptive. I think the ability to create the space for the farmer to find out what exactly works for their farm. I think that's the way to go about it. Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you mentioned how you were going to locate your 50 dairy farmers.
Yes.
And you have a strategy for trying to make that as random as possible without sort of reporting bias.
Yeah. So my plan is within this western region, within these counties. So what I would do is ask the county extension agents for some advice, and how I would try and get a more even number, because it's not I won't be able to, not collecting quantitative data on this. It will be all non-parametric. It won't be a normal sample size. So what I can do is say, oh, extension agent, do you have some large farmers, some small farmers, some of these farmers, some of those farmers, and generate a list from that and try and ask for as great a variety as possible really early on. And then using a snowball sampling method, which I think is a cool name for a sampling method, if you get like a really diverse bottom layers of like across a range of sizes, and then you ask those farmers, hey, can you recommend somebody that's not like you to farm, and you can sort of percolate those differences. So I think we're out of time, but thank you guys again for coming.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.